Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study today. We're in the book of Ezekiel. We have been for some time, but we're all the way over to chapter 37 today. We're going to study the first 14 verses, which is the prophecy of the valley of dry bones, which is one of the most, I won't say most important, they're all important prophecies, but it's probably one of the most well-known Old Testament prophecies that we're aware of. It looks like resurrection. It looks like resurrection of Israel, but it's more of a resurrection is used more as a metaphor for restoration. I want you to understand that, and you'll see it as we go. So let's start to talk about it. There is nothing in the Old Testament that can compare with New Testament passages regarding resurrection. And by that I mean you can find really graphic prophecies in the New Testament about all kinds of things in the future, resurrection being one of them. But most people agree that the main point of chapter 37 is about is not about teaching a doctrine of resurrection. It is about a national resurrection, more like a national restoration, which is what I already said. It's a coming back to life. Now that starts to sound like resurrection, but it's a coming back to life of a nation, the nation of Israel. It was a nation without a land. It was a resurrection. It was a nation without leadership. And here's the thing, it was a nation without sovereignty. You know, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, it is said that they went in as a people and they came out as a nation. Well, when they came out, they had no sovereignty. They were a nation because they were a group of people that they were banded together by a common purpose. But they had no sovereignty. They were just out there wandering around. Of course, they were under the direction of God, but they had no physical sovereignty, earthly sovereignty. And it's the way at the time of Ezekiel, it was the same way. They had no sovereignty once they were taken captive by Babylon. But the resurrection of human beings was not a totally, like I said, we really don't see a lot of graphic prophecies about resurrection in the Old Testament, but resurrection was not a totally new idea, but it was not developed in the Old Testament as it is in the New Testament. Elijah and Elisha had some involvement with resurrection. You can go read this on your own time when you get around to it. 1 Kings 17 verses 17 to 24, 2 Kings 4 verses 18 to 37, and chapter 13 verses 20 to 21. Hosea is another one. Hosea verses 6 verses 1 through 3 and Isaiah 26:19 hinted at the idea of resurrection, of a national resurrection. The verses in Hosea, you can go back and read this. We have a video on this. The verses in Hosea are pretty well hidden without some digging, but I think it applies to the second coming of Christ. And like I said, we have a video on that. You can go read about it. It's obviously going to be about resurrection, but this one with a little bit of digging, you can see it, and you can see it if you go through that video, that it could very easily be considered a prophecy of the second coming of Christ. Job also, who felt persecuted by God, if you've studied the book of Job, he felt persecuted by God, and he felt he deserved an audience with God to vindicate himself, to talk, and he talked about having a redeemer who would resurrect him so he could defend his innocence before God. You can see that in Job 14, verses 7 to 14, chapter 19, verses 25 to 27. They're very good. They're worth your time to read and ponder and meditate on. Okay, so resurrection is not completely foreign to Old Testament readers, but this is not about bodily resurrection. It looks like bodily resurrection, but it's a metaphor for restoration. You'll see it. It's about restoration of the nation of Israel, which has been dead as a nation for centuries. As I said before, it was a nation without a land, without national leadership, and the important one is it was a nation without sovereignty. And for centuries, it was to the point that their bones were being very dry, to the point of having no life in them as a nation. They obviously had live people walking around, but these are the bones of the nation. The bones of their national sovereignty were so dry because it had been for so long that they had no physical meat on their bones. Okay. A side note is that this prophecy is the inspiration for the song. Now, it's a couple of songs. This is just to let you know what goes on in the modern day. There's a couple of songs that have been written. You guys that are as old as I am will probably be more aware of this than some of the younger guys, but there was a song written when I was a child. My parents used to watch Lawrence Welk, and there wasn't that much to choose from on TV on Saturday night, so I watched it too. But there was a guy on there named Larry. It was a very deep baritone voice, and he used to sing a song, hip bone connected to the thigh bone, and the thigh bone connected to the knee bone, and the knee bone connected to the calf bone, and the calf bone connected to the ankle bone, and the ankle bone connected to the foot bone, and the foot bone connected to the toe bone. And he just worked all the way through the body. That was a very interesting song to listen to. It has a catchy tune, but it was about this scripture, the Valley of Dry Bones. There's another song that is more modern than that one. That was probably out of the 50s. But there's one more modern than that. It is a song of today that Lauren Daigle sings. It's called Come Alive, Come Alive, Dry Bones. And in that she's singing, she says, come alive. Now breathe, O breath of God. Just to think on those words is a massive, massive consideration. Sometime maybe you can listen to that song, but this is a chapter that is well known. I mean, they're even writing songs about it. We saw it last week, the promise of a new heart and a new spirit, the exhortation to remain disgraced and ashamed for your conduct. That's the thing. God did not want them to ever get over the way they related to him. But nevertheless, in chapter 36, verse 33, no, I'm sorry, that's chapter, 36, verse 33, he says, I will cleanse you from your sin. But he wants them to own forever their behavior, the thing that got them into the shape they were in. And God loved them so much that he made these promises of restoration, and it's going to come to pass. And that's what all these prophecies are about. We see them all through the Old Testament, and we see them definitely all through the New Testament. So that's where we are. The NIV commentary, the NIV application commentary in Ezekiel 37, verse 114, Page 428 says that of all of the prophecies of Ezekiel, this one is the most familiar to the average reader. What that means is we've all heard about it. And I mean, like I said, they're even writing songs about it. And if you stop and listen to the words, you know what it's talking about. This is not necessarily a good thing because we read it with the understanding that we already know what it says and what it means. So we don't really listen with our mind's eye, with our mind's ear, because we already know what we believe. But sometimes our beliefs need to be tweaked a little bit, need to be modified a little bit, maybe even need to be thoroughly changed. But this is true of all prophecy, not just this one. For example, when I studied chapter 38 and 39, which is about the war to end all wars, commentators have 7 ideas as to which war is referring to. We're not going to talk about that today, but we're pretty close to being to chapter 38 and 39. It covers everything from Armageddon to the war at the end of the millennium. It can't be completely known, or there would only be one idea. So there's a lot of good thoughts that go on. So when we read prophecy, we need to be aware of what we're reading and meditate on it. So probably we have to spend a lot of time reading it, and you probably don't spend a lot of time in prophecy when you read your Bible. The reason is because there's symbolism is involved. Sometimes a lot of history that we don't understand or we haven't studied before is involved, particularly if you're talking about Ezekiel and Hosea. So we need to always be on the lookout for where we need to make changes in the way we have our belief system set up. So clear away any belief you may have about chapter 37 and let's study together. The Valley of Dry Bones comes in verses 1 through 14, chapter 37. Let me read verses 1 through 3. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. Just a minute. Let me start that over. Verse 1. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. Okay, Ezekiel is in the Spirit. He's having a vision, and he is transported to a valley. He's in the Spirit, and God takes him to this valley. And which valley we're talking about is not important because this is a vision. The valley is full of bones. Now, if you see a bone of an animal, if you're out walking in the woods, you find a bone of an animal, or the police find a human bone, what is the assumption about the condition of the person to which the bone belongs? If you find a bone, just say it's a human bone or an animal bone, either one. What do you assume about the person that belongs to? He's dead. Otherwise, his bone wouldn't be laying out in the middle of the woods. The valley in vision is full of bones of dead people. Okay, in verse 2, he walks around and among the bones, a great many bones, he says, and they are all very dry. He noticed they were very dry. What does the condition of the bones say about the dead people to whom he belonged? Okay, we talk about if you find a bone, you kind of assume that whoever it was originally attached to is dead. But now he's got a bunch of bones. He knows they're attached to dead people. So what is inferred about the condition of the bone? The bone is very dry. That means they've been dead for a long time. They just lay there in the hot sun, baking, and animals coming along chewing on the old bones, chewing off whatever meat may be left on them, and pretty soon there's nothing left. Pretty soon all the fluid and all the moisture evaporates out of it. There's nothing but just an old dry bone left, probably bleached and scattered. Skeletons were probably not together. In reality, they might even be very scattered. You know, if a guy died in the desert, he's going to fall straight down. There's his whole skeleton going to be, eventually all the meat's going to go away and his bones are going to dry out. But unless something happens, he's going to be laying right there. But most likely, something's going to come and drag an arm bone off somewhere. So he's going to be scattered. So these bones are not together in any shape of the imagination. Verse 3, God asked, what did he ask? Let's look at verse 3. What did he ask? He asked me. He asked Ezekiel. God asked Ezekiel, Son of man, can these bones live? What would you say if he asked you that? If you're walking out there in Ezekiel's place and you see all these bones laying there and they said, okay, Kenny, can these bones live? I'm thinking, well, I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but I'll humor you, God. He said, only you know. Ezekiel answered like he thought he was being asked a loaded question, a trick question. Notice the prophet first walked around without touching the bones so as not to become defiled or made ceremoniously unclean by touching dead people. Remember last week we talked about the bloodshed in the land of Israel was part of the reason for it was part of their conduct that God was judging that and idolatry and some other things, but the bloodshed and the bloodshed was defilement of the land because it was something that was connected with the dead. And so here we find Ezekiel, who is a priest and well aware of the law, does not see himself picking up these bones. Like he doesn't say, God, you mean this bone or these bones? Picks up a whole handful of bones. Are these bones going to live? He doesn't say that. He leaves the bones alone. He never picks them up because he is aware of what touching the dead means to ceremonially uncleanness. Don't you know that Ezekiel gave a restrained answer? I said he probably thought it was a trick question, but he probably is wondering why God asks such an absurd question. Come on, God. These bones are dry and boned. They're probably bleached out white. They've been here so long. He said, what do you mean, do I think they're going to live? But he's been around God long enough to know that God's up to something when he asks a question. God doesn't ask absurd questions. He asks questions with a purpose. And that's why he asked Ezekiel. He is having a conversation with Ezekiel. Okay, let's look at verses 4 through 6. Then he said to me, or so they've been walking around looking, they've seen all these bones of the dead people, and God asked the question, can these bones live? Okay, then, in verse 4, then he said to me, prophesy to these bones and say to them, talk to these bones, Ezekiel, say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. God says, Ezekiel, prophesy to these bones and tell them this thing. You get breath, your bones come together, with all of the necessary connective tissue, which is long gone by this time. They're bleached out. You get skin. You will come to life. You will know God. Ezekiel, that's what you are to tell them, he says. Not much here for me to elaborate on, but remember, it is a vision. He's not walking in a cemetery, a physical cemetery. He's not walking out on the desert where he's finding all these dead bodies. God has transported him to this valley where he sees this vision of these dead bones, all these bones. It's a vision that Hollywood would have a heyday with. I mean, they would just go nuts with this, making a movie about it. Okay, let's look at verses 7 through 8. And I want you to remember this is a vision. Verses 7 through 8 says this. So I prophesied as I was commanded. That means I prophesied to the bones. Arm bone, he prophesied to the bones. And I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. That breath, the Hebrew word for breath, is ruah. Ruah. That is the breath from God that sustains life. It's not the breath of life that was breathed into Adam at creation, but this is related to creation because God is giving a breath that is required to sustain life. We have it. If we lose our ruah, we die. Our bodies die. Okay? He puts the ruah in them. He puts the breath that is required to sustain life. But Ezekiel looked around. He heard the noise. He heard the rattling sound of bones coming together, and bones began to connect, to pull together. Can't you just see that in the vision? There's Ezekiel standing there, only arm bones came flying across the desert and stuck in a shoulder, and the shoulder hooks onto the clavicle. It all hooks onto the spine. They're just jumping together. And then the hip bone connected to the leg bone, and the leg bone connected to the ankle, but the knee bone, and the knee bone connected to the calf bone, and the calf bone connected to the ankle bone, and the ankle bone connected to the foot bone, and the foot bone connected to the toe bone, and probably it also connected to the ring toe bone. Some of those people wore rings on their toes. That is what Ezekiel saw, these bones just coming together. And the tendon and the flesh and the skin got on them. And guess what? Now you got dead bodies that don't look like they've been dead that long, but they're still dead. The bones came together, the skin and connective tissue got on them, but they're not moving. They're not talking. They're not looking at each other saying, hey, Charlie, did you sleep well? They're not talking. They're dead. There is no life. There's no breath in them. Now let's look at verses 9 and 10. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath. Or he talked to the bones in 7 and 8. Now in 9 and 10 he says, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, and say to it. Say to the breath that is not in them. Say to the breath. This is what the sovereign Lord says. This is what you're to say. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as commanded, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. All right, we're talking about a vision. We're not talking about resurrection. We're talking about resurrection as a metaphor for restoration. Their bones as a nation have been dead for centuries. and they were just laying out there in the desert. In fact, at the time that he's doing this, having this vision, it hadn't even been that long. You got to remember that. Assyria has already put the northern kingdom into captivity. They were dead as a nation. Babylon is in the process of capturing and exiling the southern kingdom, so they're going to be dead as a nation. But it hadn't been that long. But he sees all this out on the valley floor of all these dead bones, and what he is actually seeing is a nation without sovereignty. All right, let's keep going. So he tells him to speak, prophesying some more, prophesying to the breath and the four winds and so on and so forth. He did as he's commanded. They came to life. They stood up and made a vast army. It's the metaphor for the nation. This giving of the breath of life is clearly in the context of creation when breath was given to Adam. But I want you to know, if you go back and look at the Hebrew in the interlinear Bible, the Hebrew back in, say, Genesis 2:7, when the breath of life is breathed into Adam, it is not ruah. It is the breath of life. The breath of life is something totally different than the breath that sustains life. That breath that Adam got was the special one-time breath that God gave to humans. It's the breath that brings humanity to life. He gives them the ruah to sustain their life. Okay? The ruah is what he gave to the nation of Israel. I'm laying there on the valley floor. The ruah. So now here's a vast army, resurrected and living and breathing, and it sounds like resurrection to me, but it's really, we'll keep reading, but it is a metaphor for restoration. How many times have I used the word restoration in the past chapters? It's all over the place. We're talking in prophecy here about restoration of the nation of Israel. And that's the whole house of Israel. Ezekiel is actually prophesying to the southern kingdom, which was Judah and Benjamin. It's called Judah. But when he uses the term Israel, he is talking about the whole house of Israel. So when God brings back the nation of Israel, like we're talking about here in chapter 37, he's bringing back the whole nation. Of all the ones that have been scattered, he's bringing back the northern kingdom that was scattered among the nations and assimilated into the nations by Assyria. He's talking about the southern kingdom was captured by Babylon and exiled to Babylon. And he's also talking about stuff that is probably, let's see, it would be about 2,700 years from now. And that is when Rome, it would have been about 700 years from this point, but 2,700 years to today, where Rome destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and scattered the Jews. That's a scattering that they're not even aware of. It's not even in their mind's eye. It's not even on their radar. They don't know anything about that. That's way off in the future. And that's kind of the last of the scattering. Okay, so let's see. So let's look at verse 11. Verse 11 says this. If I can find it. I turned the page too quick. Verse 11. I'm 37, not 36. Verse 11 of chapter 37 says this. Then he said to me, the vast army, they stood to their feet and got a vast army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Wow. It's a vision. The people of the vision are talking to him. These bones, the whole house of Israel, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom and others in the future, the nation of Israel from days gone by, we know this because Israel means the whole house of Israel. The bones, the resurrected people, are of the captives. They say, our bones are dried. We have no hope. We are cut off. What do they have no hope about? Think about this. This is a metaphor for a nation with no sovereignty. And he's talking about dead people in a vision to live people. These prophecies are going to people that are alive. They're in captivity and they're hearing this. These bones raise up. They're pulled together and life gets in them. And they stand up and say, but we have no hope. What they have is no hope of sovereignty, of regaining a nationhood, to become a nation with sovereignty again. We have no hope in that. These bones are way into the future, for they have not had time to become dried. That's what I just said. It hadn't been that long since the southern kingdom went into captivity. It's not been that long. But these bones are dry. So we're talking about futuristic stuff. There's no hope of ever becoming a nation, for a nation requires leaders, and all of the leaders are dead. They've all been killed. So there's no hope of rising from the ashes, so to speak. Let's look at verses 12 and 13. Therefore, he says, we have no hope. Therefore, prophesy and say to them, that's what God says, prophesy and say to them, say to these people that have risen up as a vast army, say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. And verse 13 says, then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. He's going to raise them from all the places of exile, not physical graves, though there will be some resurrection, we know that, but not in this vision. He's talking about being raised out of exile, being returned from exile, being returned from scattering. It says there will be a physical resurrection for some of them, but this is the nation being raised. This is a symbolism for a nation which has ceased to exist as a nation for a long time, that is physically dead as a nation, through those some Israelites are still alive. For sure, they are still a people with nationality. They still have nationality. They're still Jews. And everybody knows they're Jews, even in captivity. But they had no sovereignty. I want you to understand that. When we talk about them not having a nation, not being a nation, they are a nation. They are a people, just like they were when they came out of Egypt. They went in as a people. They came out as a nation, but they had no sovereignty. It's the same here. They are conquered by everybody in the world that could conquer them. So they're just kind of stuck. They have no hope. They from the words of themselves in this prophecy, we have no hope of ever becoming a nation. We have no means to do it. All of our leaders are dead, so we got nobody to lead us. Okay. So the promise from 36:24 is that there will be a gathering from the nations where they were scattered, not the dead, but the still living. the Jews that are alive, all these guys, when this scattering, it hadn't happened yet, so you know that every one of these guys is dead. Every one of the living at the time of Ezekiel is now dead. But there's going to be a gathering of all the Jews that are alive at some point in the future. Okay, let's look at verse 14. I think I had something I wanted to tell you. Maybe I'll find it and remember it in a minute. I think you'll find it interesting. Let's look at verse 14. I will put my spirit in you. Let me, before I get off of 13, I want you to hear this, because I've said it a million times, not because I said it, because I read it a million times, because God said it. It's in here. He said, they will know that I am God. And what have I told you that means? It means it's going to happen. Whatever he happens to be talking about at the time, it's going to happen in such a way as to know that God did it. He said in verse 13, then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them and bring you back into the land, he had said earlier. Then verse 14, he says, I will put my spirit in you and you will live. You will live as a nation. He's not talking about individuals. He said, as a nation, we're talking about it. You will live, and I will settle you in your own land. I'm going to bring you out of your graves. I'm going to bring you back together. I'm going to put meat on your bones, and I'm going to take you into your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. You will know that I have done it. When it's done, you will know that I did it. Verse 14, then they get a new spirit, and they will be settled, gathered into their own land. And that land is the promised land. It is a promised land. It is a land that they have never occupied, ever. God promised it to them back in the days of Moses and Abraham and all of that business. They came out of Egypt. God said, all you got to do is go in there and take it. And they couldn't do it because of their unbelief. So it hasn't happened yet. But we know it's going to happen, and it's going to happen in such a way that we know that God did it. He said there, I said, when it actually happens, we will know that God did it. He said the interesting thing about this prophecy is the stress given to the revival of the nation through manifestation of the divine is the manifestation is of divine power, not of human power. That's the other thing. It's not going to be some powerful Israeli army going to whip everybody. It's going to happen in such a way that they're going to know that it's God. It's almost like they can sit back. We've studied about Armageddon. We've read about Armageddon many times. And we know how it ends. Jesus returns and whips everybody. And he does it at such a time as to know, for the people to know that God was the one that did it. I've heard, I can't speak to this as truth, but I'm pretty sure it is true. It sounds like it could be true, that Jewish mothers teach their children that when the days get the darkest, when we are near extinction, Messiah will come. And that is exactly what Zechariah 12:8 says. Jesus is going to come back. It's going to be, it's talking about Armageddon there right before it, and they're in the process of getting the daylights beat out of them. Messiah comes. He puts his feet down on the Mount of Olives. A giant earthquake occurs, And the people, the Bible says in prophecy that they are going to realize that they crucified their Messiah. They're going to see his wounds when he puts his feet down. They're going to see him. They're going to see his wounds, and they're going to realize they crucified their Messiah, and they're going to mourn like a father mourns for the loss of an only child, only son. Okay, so it's going to be under God's power, divine power. It's not going to be big missiles and rockets and big guns and airplanes that are going to be used in a war that's going to show that Israel has saved themselves. It's going to be God saving them, and it's going to be very apparent it was them and not Israel and not a human that did it. Okay, Babylon, the Babylon exile of Judah in 600 BC. The Assyrian exile was 722 when the northern kingdom was taken into deportation. During all the time since then, Israel has not existed as a nation. They has not. How many times have you heard that they have not existed as a nation? They were still together as a nation in the scattering, but there were gobs of them still living in Israel at the times of Jesus, and even by then, they had no sovereignty. They had a nation, but they had no sovereignty. They had lived through the Babylonian exile. They had lived through the Assyrian deportation. They had lived through the time when the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon. They were not under Babylon's thumb anymore, but they were under the thumb of the Medes and the Persians. Then the Greeks come along and conquer the Medes and the Persians. That doesn't free them. They're still under the thumb of the Greeks. And then the Romans come along and conquer the Greeks. That doesn't free them into having their own nation with sovereignty. They're still under the thumb of the Romans. So all of that time, up to 70 AD, they're living without sovereignty. And at that point, of course, they're scattered everywhere, and they're all over the world. We talked about that last week. They were scattered in. God's going to bring them back from all countries. They're going to be everywhere. So if they're everywhere, they have no sovereignty. So the only way they can get back together is into nationhood is through a gathering. It will have to be a supernatural gathering because it's going to be done in such a way that they're going to know that it was God that did it. And it'll be done where they will have sovereignty. They had no means to become a nation and no hope of ever becoming a nation except for these prophecies. They know that these prophecies have been made, so they have something to look forward to that gives them hope. But they're thinking it's right around the corner. Yet in 1948, the United Nations recognized Israel. They had no hope at becoming a nation with sovereignty. And in 1948, the United Nations recognized them as a nation, gave them some land to live in, which is present-day Israel. And all of a sudden, they have sovereignty. They're a recognized nation. The Jews who live there now do not represent the gathering which will take place at the time in the future. Now I will tell you that not one of three major commentaries that I read all the time, ever give a mention to Israel becoming a nation in 1948 as a fulfillment of this prophecy. What have I told you? All right, let me tell you what they say. The New American NIV application commentary says basically that it is the philosophy the prophecy, and it points to a hope in the future. The 1948 deal, when they became a nation in 1940, points to a time of hope for the future. But they do not say that it is a fulfillment of this prophecy. I want you to remember that I said that. I want to tell you what the next one says. That was a New American Commentary. I'm sorry. The NIV application commentary says that Israel will be recreated. But what does that mean? Does it directly anticipate the formation of the present political state of Israel, or as may have been supposed, meaning 1948? He goes on to say about what is in view is a fulfillment of chapter 36, verses 24 to 28, where we talked last week about Eden-like conditions, increased productivity of the land, gathering to and a settlement in their land. We've talked now, so they're not talking about present-day Israel because the 1948 proclamation in the United Nations was not a complete fulfillment of these prophecies. Now, what have I told you about fulfillment of prophecy? A prophecy is not fulfilled until it is fulfilled. Okay? Now, they have become a nation, but do you see Eden-like conditions anywhere? Do you see them living in a land without fear, without where they feel they're living in safety? For them, every day is a question of existentialism. They every day they're fighting off missiles that are being shot into their land. So this, I can agree here with the comment that the present state of Israel, created in 48, is only a forerunner of eschatological fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. Means it had to happen first, but it is, and you probably you could sit back and say, well, it's pretty obvious that God did it, because it was a miraculous proclamation where they became a nation. But these prophecies that are required to be fulfilled have to be fulfilled before we can say that this fulfillment in 1948 is the fulfillment of prophecy. So I don't mean to throw a wet blanket on anything. I'm just saying that there's lots of times you can look at things that appear to be moving in a direction where it might be obvious that this is going to be fulfillment of prophecy. It is not fulfillment of prophecy until it is actually fulfilled in every detail. Well, here's what I wanted to tell you. The current population, I'm just about through. The ultimate prophecy, well, let me just say, in 2021, the population of Israel is 9.36 million people on a little bitty strip of land over there. In 2016, the Jewish population of New York City was 1.1 million people. In 2020, the Jewish population of the United States is 5.8 million people. So if you're looking at the population, the Jews have been scattered all over the world. If you were to look at the total population of Jewish population of the world outside of Israel, all the other lands, Europe, all over Asia, wherever Jews live, if you could total them all up, you're probably going to have a number substantially greater than the number that are living in Israel now. Do I think that they're all going to be, every last one is going to be gathered back to the land of Israel? I don't know if that's true or not. I've always had questions about what constitutes being a Jew now anyway, because of all of the scattering and the assimilation into nations sometimes kind of corrupts bloodlines. So at what point does God consider people being Jewish and not? Nevertheless, the gathering will be supernatural. We can say they're being pulled back to Israel now because they're going back over there. They're being pulled back, but I don't see anything that says a supernatural occurrence is underway. But the Bible clearly says it's going to be done in such a way that we're going to know that God did it. So we'll just see how things work out. We do know that the ultimate fulfillment will be in the return of Christ, where he will be King of Kings over all the kings of the world. And the promised land will be occupied by the Jews for the first time. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for studying with me.